let's start by talking about the listener letter and what you and 6 other colleagues or like-minded scientists wrote a letter, a brief letter to the Listener magazine, and it was in the letters to the editor section, and it was called In Defense of Science. Can you start by telling us what that letter was about, why you wrote it, and what happened in the aftermath?
So there's a fair bit of backstory to this.
Sure.
I started getting concerned about how, in this particular case, Mātauranga Māori, which is effectively it's traditional knowledge. We can go into that in a bit. Let's put a flag in that and come back to it. I became a bit concerned about how that was starting to be introduced into our university teaching. So I'm in biological sciences. I teach evolution. I teach animal nutrition, things like that. And I had been talking to colleagues. In the beginning, it was my friend Garth Cooper, who's a biochemist in my school, and also my friend Mike Corbelis, who was a professor in psychology, just about our concerns about where this potentially was heading. And we sort of broadened this discussion with a couple of other people, and around sort of 2019, 2020, Mike wrote a draft paper, a short article, with 2 other people, Robert Nola, he was retired, but he was an emeritus professor in philosophy, so he was a philosopher of science, and Elizabeth Rata. Elizabeth is was in the Faculty of Education as it was then, specialising in the teaching of science. And they wrote an article on this and submitted it to the New Zealand Journal of the Royal Society. It was rejected on the basis that they didn't have they weren't following a scholarly definition, or what was called a scholarly definition of Mātauranga. And then they tried submitting it to another journal. It was rejected again. And I suggested to Mike that since he had written for the Listener, he wrote book reviews and things like that, maybe we could write a letter to the Listener. And so we did. Now, we were concerned about 2 principal things in this letter. The first was that there are Māori schools, so there are schools in New Zealand that teach Māori students in Te Reo, the Māori language, and they were teaching things like science is a tool of colonisation. Now, along with a lot of other people, including many Māori, we were concerned about the underrepresentation of Māori in science. We wanted to increase that because we want everybody to participate in science. And obviously, if you're teaching Māori students that science is a tool of colonisation, that's unlikely to encourage them to participate. So that was one thing. And the other thing was the view that was being promoted, which was that Mātauranga Māori was equivalent to science. So we wrote this letter. It had these letters have a word limit of 300, and they let us get away with 340. But that's where that came from. So it made those 2 simple points. One, that we didn't think students should be taught that science was a tool of colonisation, and 2, partly because we wanted to encourage Māori students into science, and 2, we didn't think it was appropriate to be saying that Mātauranga Māori was equivalent to science. Now, I can unpack those in various ways if you want.
So there was some legislation or educational policy that was making them equivalent. If I understood correctly, 16 to 18-year-olds were being taught a science curriculum that included Maori myth and legend. Is that accurate? Or
no? I think that would be that would kind of misrepresent what was happening. Can I read you
Yes.
a quote. I'm going to give you the Royal Society of New Zealand definition of Mātauranga Māori, partly because I can't get in trouble for doing that.
All right.
But this is an accepted definition. So this says Mātauranga Māori is the intellectual capital generated by whānau, that's families, hapu, that's sub-tribes, and iwi, which is tribes, over multiple generations. It is a shared community knowledge that is embedded in lived experience and carried in stories, song, place names, dance, ceremonies, genealogies, memories, visions, prophecies, teachings, and original instructions, as learnt through observation and copying of other community members. It is a holistic system of orally passed knowledge, concepts, belief, and practice. Mātauranga Māori, Mātauranga a iwi, Mātauranga a hapu, and Mātauranga a whānau are dynamic, innovative, and generative systems of knowledge. Now that's the Royal Society of New Zealand, Royal Society Te Aparangi definition of Mātauranga Māori. Now other people will define it in different ways. So what's really important to understand, and one of the things that people internationally, when they sort of weigh in on this, often upset Māori about, is that they focus on the myths, the spirituality, and so on. And that's in the mix. That's part of Mātauranga Māori. But that can obscure or underplay the extent to which that Mātauranga Māori also includes a great deal of empirical knowledge, particularly in environmental things, natural history, that sort of thing. The sorts of knowledge that Māori developed over 700 to 800 years of living on this landmass, on these islands, to survive. And so the sorts of things that people started saying they wanted to include was some of the natural history stuff to some extent. But in the beginning, we were getting some spiritual concepts, particularly Māori. Now that's M-A-U-R-I as opposed to Māori, which is the people. So Māori it's like a life force. So it's a vitalist concept. And the idea is that this is inherent in both living and non-living things. So it's in rocks, it's in trees, it's in mountains, it's in rivers, and so on. These have Māori. And this concept, which is similar to let's say, vitalism in Japanese culture or something, this is not unique to Māori. This was used in teaching in a way, in some context, to reflect environmental health, something like that. You'd say, so some Māori will say that the Māori reflects the extent to which, say, a river or a stream can support life. And if the Māori is diminished, it could be through pollution or other problems. People have been using that as kind of a shorthand for that. But it is inherently a vitalist, spiritual concept. So it's difficult with Mātauranga Māori to distinguish between the empirical knowledge, which has a basis in fact, and this might be when particular trees flower, at what times of year, what sort of things different types of birds eat, how you catch eels, when different groups of fish will spawn, all of these sorts of things that Māori would use to survive. If I can read you another quote, which I particularly like, which this was actually written in a series of letters in the Listener in response to our original one. But this is by an emeritus professor. He's at Australian National University, called Athol Anderson. Now he's Ngāi Tahu, so he's Māori from the South Island. And so I'm just reading this as a direct quote. Modern Mātauranga emphasises integration over separation of knowledge categories, received over hypothesised interpretations, and experiential over experimental practice. Science and Mātauranga are thus intrinsically contradictory approaches to knowledge that resist both combination and interrogation of one by the other. Even attempting to align theoretically rational science with Mātauranga faces a fundamental problem in the monolithic construction of the latter. Mātauranga is conceived as comprehensive of Māori knowledge and intellectual approaches, both of which range beyond natural and social phenomena into magic, ritual, and myth. Consequently, where Mātauranga equivalence with science is simply assumed, e.g. in scientific publication of modern fables about Polynesian voyaging to Antarctica as if they were historical events, both approaches are likely to be compromised. And I think that's a really great way of capturing the difference. If you can imagine university disciplines, and you've been to you have a PhD, so you'll understand this. It's as though all university disciplines, including the arts, humanities, all of these things, theology, they're all combined with STEM disciplines indivisibly. They're just continuous and understood in that. And you can also explain that in terms of a very important concept called whakapapa, which is, it's like a family tree, and all different sort of animals and trees and things fit into that as though into a family tree, but it goes back up to the Māori pantheon, Ranginui and Papatuanuku, the gods. And this all goes down through various demigods and so on into different branches of this. Now, at the base of the tree, there is empirical knowledge. An example of that is the association between kumara, the sweet potato, and kiori, the rat. And these were associated because kiori would hang around kumara pits because they'd eat the kumara if they got half a chance. But then that goes back up through this network up to the Māori pantheon, and it's indivisible. And this is why I think what I like about the Ethel Anderson quote is that it captures the fact that if you want to understand Mātauranga Māori, you have to understand this indivisibility, that this way that the spiritual and the empirical are connected in a way that they are not in science. So you can see how if somebody, a scientist from overseas, wants to criticize this, they could talk about it in terms of, well, this is myth. Well, it is at one end, but it's not at the other. And so it's I'm sorry that this is complicated, but
no, that's fine.
But it just is.
I would I think I would personally question whether the empirical knowledge is in itself science, i.e., I think that for science requires more than just observation. For example, just knowing the habits of rats. There's also hypotheses. There are hypotheses and predictions and testing of predictions. It's falsifiability, all of which seems to be absent from this. And that seems to me to be something different from just intimate local knowledge of, say, hunting techniques, or which animals tend to, what different ways animals tend to behave, or when certain blossoms flower, etc. It's missing it's both just lacking in kind of hypotheses, and also, I'm not a scientist, so I might be wrong in this, but also it's kind of too specific. It's all jaguars, no quarks. Am I making sense?
Well, is the word you're looking for epistemology?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I'm thinking about science in the kind of way that Popper would define it, or
Sure.
David Deutsch.
Sure.
And it's one of the things in which I disagree with, one of the few places where I've disagreed with Steven Pinker.
Yeah, as in this.
Yeah. So,
right.
Popper, Steven Pinker has a book, Rationality.
Yep.
Which is a great book, but he begins by talking about primitive peoples. And I'm using primitive in a technical sense, i.e. more closely resembling the common ancestor. And in that sense, I would say that Maori culture is more primitive than Western culture because it's closer to the way that everybody lived and the kinds of things that everybody probably believed further back in the past. So it has a closer, more direct connection to a deep human past. So primitive, in one of the ways that the word primitive is used in evolutionary biology, if I've understood correctly, is more closely resembling the common ancestors. So I'm using primitive in that sense. And Pinker is talking about hunter-gatherer cultures in general, and he says that they were rational because they knew how to track animals and read signs, and they knew how to predict where certain animals were so that they could hunt them efficiently. And I think that there's something missing there from a definition of rationality. And I wouldn't describe that kind of thing as being science per se.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. First of
Sorry.
all, Maori were not hunter-gatherers because they had agriculture. They grew crops. So there's that. I agree with you in terms of the difference between by empirical, I mean, some people will talk about truth as justified true belief. But if you use the word truth, and this is probably one of the things that we got into trouble for in the last paragraph of the listener letter, I mean, what we said is, however, in the discovery of empirical universal truths, Indigenous knowledge, falls far short of what we can define as science itself. So I agree with you in that sense. It's not organized as science. If you ask, how was this knowledge developed, Mātauranga, you will be told trial and error. Now, we can learn a lot about fish from talking to commercial fishermen. I've spoken to lots of commercial fishermen. I'm a fish biologist, and they have great knowledge of where fish are and what they do and all of those sorts of things. But we don't. That knowledge is not assembled or produced in the same way that science is, and in the way that it's a continuous system of sort of correction and building on established knowledge, and you develop hypotheses based on theory, etc., etc. So this is kind of where I think science diverges. And if you read history of science, people like Anaximander that came up with explanations for things, not just what is, but why is it the way it is. And so what people will say, if I'm trying to sort of steelman an argument against what you're saying, although I fundamentally agree with it, some people will say, look, a lot of ecological research is just observation. People will go out and look at things, they'll count things, they might count trees, weeds, whatever, rabbits, doesn't matter. And they will publish that information and say they're doing science. That is kind of used as a way to argue, yes, but empirical knowledge does pass as science in certain contexts. And it's no accident that the areas of science into which people have tried to incorporate Mātauranga are mainly the sort of the more ecological, environmental side of things, particularly to do with things like sustainability and so on. I agree with you, but to be perfectly honest, I think a lot of what scientists publish as science doesn't actually meet the bar for science, because they're not actually looking at the fundamentals of what's going on. In other words, trying to explain why things are the way they are. Judea Pearl, who's a computer scientist, has written a book called The Book of Why, in which he talks about the importance of causal theory. You have to, in other words, science is about establishing cause and effect. And I don't think Mātauranga Māori does that. I once was talking to Dan Hikaroa, who's one of the proponents of Mātauranga Māori as science. And I brought up Judea Pearl's ideas on the importance of understanding causation. And he said, well, Māori didn't need to know why things happened, only that they happened. So in other words, they didn't know why a particular tree flowered at a particular time of the year. They just know that it coincided with a particular phase of the moon or a particular time of the season and so on.
Yeah, the explanations part seems to me to be at least a crucial element of science. And if you have irrational explanations that are tied to practical observations, then that completely disqualifies it as anything scientific for me, even if the practical knowledge was quite useful in some ways, because it's that Popperian thing of hard to vary explanations that's vital in science. So if you can say that the rain is caused by praying to some Maori god, and I can say that I'm a Parsi Zoroastrian. It's a really ancient religion and culture. So I could also say that no, it's caused by something you do at the Agiari at the fire temple or whatever. Then there's those explanations can be varied indefinitely, and there's no way of testing the validity or of really disproving the validity. They don't make usually predictions that can be falsified. So it's not, for me, it has fundamentally nothing to do with science, or should have nothing to do with science.
Well,
maybe I'm getting too much off topic here.
No, you're not getting off topic. It's just it's quite complicated how and why this has been happening here. Now, decolonize. So this is associated with and I'm going to call it an ideology called decolonization, which is not unique to New Zealand at all. There have been a couple of Quillette articles about it, one by Claire Lehman in Australia and another one by Jonathan Kay in Canada. So this phenomenon is influencing what we teach at universities in a lot of the Anglophone world. And it's often associated with Indigenous people, and it's used as a sort of a justification for the rights of Indigenous people. So the way it worked in New Zealand, if I can present this in a fairly simple way.
Yes, please do.
In 2020, the then Minister of Education, Chris Hipkins, who subsequently became the Prime Minister, signed into effect this thing called Mātauranga, which means equal status or equal value. And this was interpreted quite broadly. I would say there's been an enormous amount of concept creep over this. And what this meant was that in education, Mātauranga Māori should be considered equivalent to what they might call Western knowledge. Now, I object that the term Western science is widely used as well. And in the listener letter, we talked about the use of Western science. They used the term Western before in terms of culture. And there's no question that the Enlightenment has played a great role in the development of science, because it was what, if you look at Galileo and so on, it was what stopped the church telling people what they could and couldn't believe. And so naturalistic explanations obviously were verboten if the church was controlling things. But with Mātauranga, the term mana means respect, value, prestige. So this was kind of about people showing that they valued Māori, that they respected Māori. But the problem is, in my view, this has led to a situation where in our educational institutions, not just universities, but schools as well, we are undermining both science and Mātauranga Māori by holding them up against each other as though they were equivalent. Now, various people have said, well, saying they're equivalent doesn't mean they're the same. But I kind of think the way, in operational terms and pragmatic terms, that's a distinction without a difference. Because people are saying, well, no, if they're equivalent, that means that we have to teach Mātauranga Māori in science class. Well, okay, so that doesn't mean they're the same, but what's the difference? It might as well.
It's like teaching creationism in science class, alongside Darwinism, seems to me.
And that is what I said back in 2016 when I first objected to this. Because, as I said, I teach evolution. I once, at the end of a first year class, I had a student come up to me and she was quite angry, and she said, "You've just been talking to us about what you think about evolution now, but I would like to present to the class my ideas on evolution." And I had a fairly good idea of what was coming, and I said, "Well, sorry, that's not going to happen." And she was quite taken aback that I wouldn't let her tell the class about her ideas on evolution. And she said, why can't I? And I said, well, two reasons. One, I'm the one that's being paid to do this, not you. And second, this is a science class. It was an evolution and ecology paper taught by the Faculty of Science. And I said, so we're going to teach this from a science perspective. I said, I'm not denying that there are other viewpoints, but we're approaching this from a scientific perspective. And as far as I'm concerned, just to finish the point, I think it is a real problem that if we're going to say, yes, we'll consider Mātauranga Māori equivalent, and so, we're going to put that in science class, and that's really the justification, mana orite. But then people can say, religious people who believe in special creation, they might say, well, why are you considering this one equivalent and not the other? Now, I mean, there are all sorts of rabbit holes that we can go down here, but the way this is currently being taught in secondary schools and at university is through a thing called knowledge systems. And I don't know who first came up with this. It's being propagated through the schools in New Zealand, and it's got into universities, particularly by Rosemary Hipkins. Now, if that name sounds familiar, it's because Chris Hipkins
I don't.
Well,
I've never heard of them, sorry.
Chris Hipkins was the person who, as Minister of Education, signed off on the mana orite policy. He subsequently became Prime Minister. Rosemary is his mother, and she's an educationalist. So she has, I don't think she developed it, but she has used this knowledge systems framing, whereby they say science is one knowledge system, Mātauranga Māori is another knowledge system. And we have to consider knowledge systems equivalent. And we want students to appreciate that there are different ways of looking at the world. And so that is the justification for doing this. At my university this year, for the first time in the Faculty of Science, is teaching a course where students are taught about Mātauranga Māori and various other aspects of Māori life, tikanga, which is kind of a traditional practice, customs, those sorts of things. This is being taught in a compulsory course and through a knowledge systems framing. And my argument against this is that it's fundamentally anti-science, because this whole idea of equivalent, there are lots of different knowledge systems. This is like, if you go back to Derrida, in French postmodernism, which you probably know something about, this is just a form of social constructivism or cultural relativism. But science can't go there. I mean, if you accept this, why bother with science? The reason we bother with science is because it works. And we have explained things, and we've made mobile phones, we've gone to the moon, and we've developed vaccines and all of these sorts of things. So it works, and that's not to disparage anybody's culture. It's not to belittle anybody else's views, but it's to say, if we want to do science, then there are certain rules. And two of the most fundamental ones, and this is partly, from Popper, but it's not just Popper. One, all ideas have to be contestable. So, in other words, you put your idea forward and anybody's free to criticize it. The other one is that there's no authority. So everybody can play this game. The idea is that what we this contest is based on reason and evidence. So we judge ideas, we pick which ideas are better than others, or we can use the term hypotheses if we want to be strictly Popperian. We select the best hypothesis based on the evidence supporting it. Now, you can be a strict falsificationist or not. I know lots of people like using Bayesian statistics these days. I do as well. And that's based on probability. In other words, what's the most likely explanation? You're not necessarily saying one's wrong. You're just saying the balance of evidence at the moment is one way rather than the other. So I'm sorry if that was a bit of a rant, but
no, not at all.
But that's the way I'm seeing this distinction. And so I argue that I think what we're doing is damaging both science and Mātauranga Māori, and I think we're going to end up confusing our students by taking this knowledge systems approach. This is the sort of thing that I think could legitimately be taught in a gen ed course, a general education course. There are other ways of teaching this, but actually applying this to science is distorting what science is. And it's also going to end up distorting what Mātauranga Māori is, because this is going to lead, the people from overseas who aren't familiar with the details of Mātauranga Māori to say things that Māori might find offensive, like this is just myths and legends.
Yeah, understood. When I remember this, I remember reading very briefly about the listener letter at the time, a few years ago, and I actually didn't understand the controversy because I assumed it was about whether Maori mythology and history and anthropology should be taught. I just failed to grasp this, that it was about placing it on an equivalence with science. It didn't even occur to me that people would do that, because that seemed so crazy, seemed such a crazy thing to do. And you're right that it degrades the Maori culture as well as science, because if I am looking at the culture, say Australian Aboriginal culture, which I find completely fascinating, and Aboriginal history is also extremely fascinating, and that's where I feel there is a great deal of worth. But if someone says to me, for example, recently a town council which went in and repaired water damage to a bridge which needed urgent repairs, we're told that they shouldn't have done that because it could have offended some water god, some Aboriginal local water god. When I hear that, my response is, this stuff is nonsense. So if you're asking me to evaluate it alongside science, I'm going to evaluate it in a very harsh way. Whereas when it's about understanding human histories and cultures and beliefs, that's another thing altogether. I don't know if I'm making sense there.
No. That's pretty much the way I sort of feel about this. I don't want to be put in a position of having to say something is nonsense, because. But I mean, I really like the perspective that Jonathan Rauch presents in the Constitution of Knowledge. Which is basically just that in order to have a functioning democracy, we have to agree on a common set of facts. And if we're saying, well, there are different knowledge systems, there are different ways of looking at the world, then you're legitimizing what in the States they call alternate facts, which in that context, I mean, we can see where that leads you.
Yeah.
And what then happens is that nobody can agree on anything, and so you just end up in intractable arguments. You end up in what's referred to as a Foucauldian. This is after, Michel Foucault, a universe where everything is just a contest of power. Power is knowledge, knowledge is power, and there's no right and wrong. I think that poses a fundamental problem to society if that's where we go. Now, I think we also would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that there's a very, very strong political element to decolonization. It is inherently political. In New Zealand, kind of the sort of the Bible for decolonization stuff is this book by Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, Decolonizing Methodologies. This has been hugely cited. It's been very influential in Canada and in other places around the world. But this is really an argument. There's a lot of historical grievance in it, much of which is legitimate. If we go back into the 19th century about how Māori were treated by, colonists and so on, having their land taken off them and all sorts of injustices, not being able to speak te reo. But you don't solve two wrongs don't make a right. So I want to make sure I'm not a politician. I'm not an activist, although I've been told, when I want to talk about the difference between activism and scholarship, and I think that's something that we should probably touch on today if you want to.
Sure.
But, I've been told, yes, you're an activist for science. Well, the answer is, if I show you the piece of paper that the university gave me when they hired me, it says I was to teach science. So that's actually what I'm paid to do. I'm not making it up. It's not a personal agenda, and that's partly what the difference is. But I think there is an awful lot of politics here, and we saw this very recently in my own university news. So here's another quote. Now, this is somebody I probably better not name him, but he's an academic, a professional teaching fellow in our law faculty. So this says, for this person, academia is not just a career path, but an opportunity for transformation. He sees universities as central to the colonial project in Aotearoa. That's a Māori name for the North Island and is now being used as the Māori name for New Zealand by some, and believes they have a responsibility to undo its damage. And this is a quote. We need to start realizing that universities were one of the primary tools of colonization in Aotearoa, replacing Māori philosophy, Māori ways of thinking, speaking, and acting. That places an obligation on academics today to really contribute to the deeper, longer-term decolonization project. Well, as far as I'm concerned, you can have that or you can have universities, but you can't have both, because we can't allow people to come in and run their own private political project when they are being given the privilege of teaching students who are paying to come to university to learn about specific things, their chosen subjects of choice. Now, that may be Mātauranga Māori, and we may decide as a university that we think it's sufficiently important for New Zealand students to have a certain understanding of Te Ao Māori, sort of the Māori worldview, and Mātauranga Māori, that we put it in class. But that doesn't mean we present it as other topics. So I think this difference, I think a lot of the problem boils down to, and actually originates from, because Linda Smith, the book I just showed you, she was an academic, she did a PhD at my university, subsequently went to Waikato University, and her husband, Graham, has also been very influential in this. And the good thing about his papers is he's quite explicit about the political nature of what he calls, in this case, kaupapa Māori, which is kind of like a teaching, a Māori way of approaching education. And he says this is explicitly political. He's, it's great that he's quite sincere about what he says, and there's a place for that. And maybe what universities should do, if we want to teach Mātauranga Māori in that respect, is rather than embedding this in all the different, in arts and in law and engineering, etc., we set up faculties of Mātauranga Māori. We have in New Zealand tertiary education institutes that are taught in Māori and Te Reo, and essentially the students Māori students would be immersed in Te Ao Māori at these, we call them wānanga, and we have 3 of those at the moment, and I think there are more being developed. But so we already have institutions where Māori students can go, be immersed in Te Ao Māori and so on. But we're not going to develop Māori academics in particular disciplines if we destroy those disciplines in the process.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's like the difference between teaching a language and teaching everything through the medium of that language, i.e., you can go and learn Gujarati if you like, but it's another thing to say that our entire language, all of our subjects must be taught through the medium of Gujarati. In fact, it's much worse than that, because Gujarati could be a perfectly neutral medium through which to teach things. Everything has to be taught inflected through this point of view. And that is, and earlier you were quoting somebody who was talking about the importance of respect, or the concept of respect, cultural respect. And I think that's a kind of nice sounding thing, but respect is not something that has any place in science. You don't accept or reject an idea based on how much respect you have for the person who is promoting it, or how much respect you have for the culture that is embracing it. It needs to stand and fall on its own merits.
That's the second Jonathan Rauch point. There's no authority.
Yeah.
We, I mean, I don't know whether you want to get into the sort of the fallout from the listener letter, which is,
yes,
I mean, that was in 2021, and it's a bit boring, but we were accused of having done untold harm. And one of the things that happened on the morning the letter came out and the issue was published is that a postdoctoral fellow in my school, a Māori postdoctoral fellow, was allowed to send an email to all staff and students in the school saying that henceforth the School of Biological Sciences at the University of Auckland was no longer culturally safe for Māori students because Garth Cooper, by the way, is Māori. This is the funny thing, and some of these people didn't realise he was Māori, but he is. It's so anyhow. The school was culturally unsafe because we were in it. And, there were, I mean, what ensued after that was this sort of really boring and silly moral panic where committees met and wrote letters to my head of school saying that Garth and I should be prevented from teaching undergraduates, supervising graduates, or coming into the building. Which would have been the equivalent of firing us. It's hard to think what
I'll include all of the details, the letter and the other documentation you sent in the show notes to the podcast, which if you're watching this on YouTube, the show notes are on the Quillette.com website as opposed to below the video. Otherwise, if you're listening to this as an audio, you can go to the Quillette.com site and find the full show notes and transcription and things there. And I'll include it also if people want to really get into the nitty-gritty of who said what and wrote which letters, they can follow it in detail.
Great. Because it's not very interesting rehashing all of this. It really isn't. I'd much rather deal with what we've got now, 4 years, almost 4 years on, and really, I mean, I know an awful lot more about Mātauranga Māori now than I did then, but I had read an awful lot about it back then, and in fact, we all had. One of the things we were accused of not knowing anything about Mātauranga Māori, which fundamentally wasn't true, because we'd read work by lots of Māori scholars, and the article that Mike, Robert, and Elizabeth had written quoted a lot of these people, but you can't quote people in a 300-word letter to a magazine. We did this only because we were denied the opportunity of publishing our views in a scholarly journal, simply on the basis they said, oh, you're not adhering to the contemporary definition of Mātauranga. What was their contemporary definition of Mātauranga? That it was equivalent to science. So there's absolutely no point in writing a paper in which we admit that the whole point of the letter was that we don't agree with that. And so all they were doing with this fairly sort of simple and silly rhetorical device is actually preventing anybody contradicting what they were saying. This is dogma. It can't be challenged. And this is the problem. And this is I think a real issue with trying to teach some of this material in science class, because, as you said, everything in science is up for challenge. You can criticize it, and you're entitled to. Of course, we prefer that people criticize it based on evidence. In other words, you have a reason, rather than just saying, I don't like the sound of this. This offended me. That this term offence, lots of people came out and said, oh, the listener letter, was we're accused of all sorts of things, including racism and white supremacy and all of this sort of stuff. But the best person to listen to on how to deal with that is John McWhirter. Just say, well, no, I'm not. Racism is bigotry expressed through the lens of race. I'm not disparaging anybody on the basis of race. But I think this is, interestingly, with respect, I think we have to respect people, but we don't have to respect their ideas, and I don't think we should be made to respect ideas. I do respect Mātauranga Māori. I acknowledge my friend Mary Roberts, who I was speaking to this morning. Now she taught at Wānanga in Whakatane in the Bay of Plenty for 5 years. She taught environmental science there to Māori students. And she's taught me a great deal about Mātauranga Māori, particularly from an environmental perspective. But the really important thing is that this Māori, people outside New Zealand might get the impression that all Māori are sort of activists like this. That's just not true. Māori are the same as everybody else. They're individuals and they think for themselves. And certainly Garth and Mary and other, plenty of other Māori friends and colleagues don't go along with what's happening. But as I said, there are political motives for this. It's essentially a way of extending control and a way of if you're going to say we have to teach this or this has to be taught, people have to be hired to do that, and so this is creating employment for people who aren't necessarily qualified in the discipline that they're actually giving the lecture, and etc. There are all sorts of agendas at play here. And now many of these people are very well intentioned and have honourable motives, but I think the highest motive has to be, what are universities for? In other words, what is somebody like me paid to do? And I'm really concerned that we're creating an environment where, just look at what's happening to universities in the States at the moment. I mean, I have colleagues, at American universities who are completely traumatized by what's going on now, because they've had their funding completely cut and they're being told they're not allowed to teach certain things. That's the last thing I want to happen here. But if we're not careful and if we don't stick to our knitting, that's where we're going to get. We can't, as academics, I don't think it's appropriate for us to use privilege in teaching students for essentially furthering our own personal and political ambitions.
You wanted to talk in the email that you sent to me also a little bit about institutional neutrality
Sure.
and the importance of institutional neutrality at
Yeah.
universities. And that's something that I have also really noticed here in Australia. So, for example, we recently had a referendum. It was called the Voice to Parliament.
Yeah.
And one of the problems actually with the referendum was that it was a bit unclear what the voice to Parliament would actually entail if it were became law, but if it became constitutional. But it was basically about having a committee of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders to advise on various, maybe all aspects of government. The details were really unclear, and I looked into it in quite a lot at the time, but it was very hard to disentangle what exactly would happen. So this was a complicated legal and political debate. But when you went onto the campus at UTS here in Sydney, where I have friends who teach, so I've often been at UTS, there were big banners everywhere saying, "We at UTS support voting yes to the voice to Parliament." And I find that kind of quite extraordinary, that the university should be a place where you can freely discuss ideas rather than a place where ideas are dictated and mandated either from on high or by some kind of majority vote. And we recently ran a long article on the American Association of University Professors, and their view is that when there's a controversial or a divisive political view, one of the things you should do is take a vote of all your faculty members, and if the majority of them support one side of that view, you should mandate that as the official university view. So,
Yeah.
uh, which
Yeah.
is just,
As though the truth is normally distributed. Yeah.
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 I think you said that somewhere you are in one of the pieces that you sent to me to read, said that, let me see, let me find the actual quote because it's quite nicely put. Almost all original ideas start life as minority views. When a university sides with a majority, it risks snuffing out important insights before they can gain traction. So I thought that was very eloquently put.
The great example of this from science is plate tectonics or continental drift. You know, the person that came up with that was told he was an idiot and he was wrong, and he was really almost excluded from the discipline for a while. But because the evidence favoured the fact that continents move, and we can, the classic example is the way that sort of the eastern rim of South America fits into the west coast of Africa and so on. You can see that, and now that's received, that's just universally accepted. That's how ideas develop, and that's why just having a vote on things doesn't get you anywhere. But I think a lot of this has come about because of the influence of critical social justice ideology,
Hmm.
which I've learned a lot about through reading and Quillette articles and listening to Quillette podcasts.
Yay, thank you.
Well, so I think this idea that there are the oppressed and the oppressors, this very reductive idea that everybody's one thing or the other, and because I'm a white male, that means I'm an oppressor, so I can go and sit in the corner, and really what I should be doing is listening to the oppressed. I think a lot of what's going on here is people are playing on that, because there are many people, as Eric Kaufman says in his book, which I also have here, Taboo. He makes the point that a lot of people genuinely do feel some sort of sense of historical guilt for what their great-great-great-grandparents or something did. And I just think we need to right wrongs. If there are injustices, contemporary injustices, then they need to be addressed. But we can't perpetually live a couple of hundred years ago and just rehash old grievances over and over again in order to get our way now. What we need to do is actually to figure out what problems we've got in society and fix them. And so getting back to institutional neutrality.
Can I just interject one thing, which
Sure.
is that I am quite evangelical about Adam Kirsch's book on settler colonialism, Ideology of Violence and
I've read that.
Justice.
Yep.
It's a fantastic book, and I think it's I just want to mention that to listeners in case they're not familiar with it, because I think it's a great explainer and antidote to some of this decolonial
Yeah, it is.
ideology.
I mean, he uses the particular context of Israel and Palestine, and points out that, I mean, the idea that you can just talk about people as settlers, that is supposed to mean henceforth you can just ignore everything they say, because their motive, essentially what it's about is cancelling, not cancelling, but automatically giving people the worst of all possible motives. And I think we have to use the principle of charity. We have to try and hear people out. We should try and steelman their arguments, which is what I've been trying to do with Mātauranga Māori. And it's because I think Mātauranga Māori is valuable and should be respected that I don't think it should be held up against science, because I think that's an unfair comparison for the reasons that Ethel Anderson explained in the quote I gave earlier. Institutional neutrality was interesting with the listener letter because our Vice-Chancellor immediately came out and said that what we said did not reflect the views of the university, which is kind of interesting because all the people who wrote it were at the university. I mean, we were never claiming that we spoke for the university. And in fact, I should probably have said at the outset of this podcast that what I've said here does not reflect the views of my institution. But I can't for the life of me think why anybody would think they did. So,
yeah, it doesn't make sense for anybody to come out and say, I speak for the university.
Yeah. Why would anybody think that? So I think the default position should be institutional neutrality. In other words, I'm not speaking on behalf of my institution. I'm the University of Auckland. I'm speaking on behalf of myself. But anyhow, what happened was our VC was very, very heavily attacked both nationally and internationally, including in the UK press, for having attacked us simply for defending science. And 2 weeks after she wrote that initial statement, she wrote another statement in which she said, of course, the university, doesn't have a particular view on this, and we want to encourage this. And what she said I'm going to do, and this was on the 13th of August 2021, I remember the date, she said, we're going to host a symposium to discuss, the issue of the relationship between Mātauranga Māori and science. And guess what? Never happened.
You weren't invited to the symposium?
No, well, it's never happened. It's never happened.
Oh, it's never happened, right?
No. And I think that's very interesting. Because I think what better way of allowing everybody to have their say than having a symposium where everybody gets to have express their views.
But presumably there's a lot of self-censorship on this issue as well.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the things that Jerry Coyne details in his article is other academics having written, I think to you or to him or both. I can't remember the exact details because he really goes into the weeds here. But in effect, other academics having written to say, I agree with everything that was said in the Defense of Science letter, which is a really brief and extremely innocuous letter. I mean, I just kind of for anybody, if some rational alien landed on this planet from the planet Zorg, and I showed them this letter and I said, do you think this letter caused any controversy? They would be like, no. How could this cause any controversy? There's nothing intrinsically controversial about the letter, as far as I'm concerned. But lots of academics wrote, or at least some academics wrote and said, I agree with this letter, but I don't dare to say so publicly, because otherwise I could be fired, or, there could be repercussions at the university, which is just extraordinary to me.
So, this is ultimately what's called preference falsification, that people will kind of outwardly, I had lots of people coming up to me and saying, I agree with you, but, I'd never say that publicly. The one thing that never happened to me is nobody came up to me and told me I was an asshole for writing the letter. I mean, there were people, there were, what happens with people like that is when you try and get into a setting where you can have a discussion with them. We had in May last year, there was a one-day symposium on the future of New Zealand universities that was held in Wellington. And I was asked, we wanted to discuss the Mātauranga Māori science issue, and I was asked to provide a list of people who had criticised us who could be invited to speak, because we wanted to hear what they had to say. And I gave them that list. None of these people accepted. And this sort of practice of self-exclusion is very convenient, because it means, A, you don't have to defend your position. B, you can then say, oh, there were no Maori voices in this. And if they say, well, you were given the opportunity, they'll say, oh, it wasn't a culturally safe environment. A culturally safe environment means nobody says anything that you disagree with. And how can I just don't understand how academics can hew to this sort of thinking and call themselves academics when we're supposed to be scholars who are objective. It doesn't matter who's right or who's wrong in any particular instance, but it's really important that everybody should be able to express their point of view, rather than some people being told, no, you're not allowed to say anything that might upset me. I mean, it's not as though
should be the forum for that, for discussion of ideas.
So we're hopeful that, in fact, it was supposed to be announced this month. I don't know whether that's still going to happen, but in the coalition agreement that was signed with the present government in New Zealand, one of the elements in that was a policy that would enforce universities to adhere to academic freedom. And also, I think there's going to be a provision for institutional neutrality in that. And that would, I'm hopeful that happens, because what that would mean is that universities cannot adopt positions that are politically partisan, which is what's happening at the moment. I don't think... go on, sorry.
I wanted to ask a question which... I didn't mean to interrupt you, though, so please finish what you were saying.
All good.
I want to ask a question which you might not have an answer to, and maybe we'll cut this part out of the podcast if it proves to be unfruitful. But one thing that happens in Australia is, since there's no genetic testing of people to see whether they have Aboriginal ancestry or not, and also you definitely can have Aboriginal ancestry and not look Aboriginal, because depending on what proportion of ancestry you have, clearly. And I mean, I have Indian ancestry and I don't look very Indian, so I sympathize with that. But there's also been a huge increase in the number of Aboriginal Australians, an increase that is too great and rapid to be attributed to births, and therefore must be the result of more people identifying as Aboriginal. And some of that could be because they didn't identify before because of stigma, and now there's no stigma. On the contrary, it's considered kind of an honor. And the other reason, of course, could be just that there are now more incentives. So a lot of people in universities who are pressing for this kind of decolonial ideology and are claiming to be speaking for Aboriginal Australians might not even have any Aboriginal ancestry themselves at all. So it seems like, to me, this has become, for many people, this has surely become a grift. Although it's really hard to pinpoint individuals and say this specific person is just exploiting the system. Then statistically, it just suggests that for many people, this just claiming the ancestry is something convenient that allows them to claim authority for their political views or for their academic projects, which, again, this wouldn't matter if we just let the political views and the academic projects stand and fall on their own merits, rather than basing it on what group the people allegedly belong to who are promoting these viewpoints. I don't know whether you want to answer that or...
Well, I'll say a couple of things. Fully aware that this is an absolute minefield. So there's this idea, have you heard of this idea of blood quantum?
No.
If anybody brings up the fact that, well, okay, so you had in New Zealand, the way it works with Maori is that if you have any Maori ancestry, any at all, you're considered Maori. So I'm not going to contest that. I'm not arguing with that. I'm not offering a viewpoint on that at all. But if anybody sort of starts raising this, it gets people bring up this idea of blood quantum, which is, one drop of blood. It's a reference to the old idea with back in the days of slavery in the United States, that if you had a drop of blood, then you were one particular race or the other. And of course, this gets into sort of the ideas of Aryan supremacy and how did you identify Jews? Well, if they had any Jewish ancestry, we should kill them, and this sort of thing. So I don't like any of that. I don't think that's a productive way to go. What I will say is that what I object to is this idea that lived experience is somehow superior to evidence and reason in resolving a disagreement over a point of fact.
Yeah.
I don't think there was a lot of this. And this is why it was quite funny in the beginning with the listener letter that when people found out that Garth was Maori. And one of the activists who wrote a particularly nasty article about it sort of wasn't aware of this, and then that Garth was Maori. And subsequently, when she was made aware of it, she said, "Oh well, he's obviously divorced from his Mātauranga." In other words, he's not the right sort of Maori.
Oh no,
which is just
he's an Uncle Tom.
Yeah. Well, this is but I was talking to Mary this morning, and there is a great deal of social pressure put on people by, I was going to say activists, but it's broader than that. It's people who feel a sense of commitment to a particular sort of identity and so on. And so all sorts of things are going on that people are placed under pressure to say certain things or not say certain things, or to, go along with some things and not others. But I just don't think that has much of a place. But this is identity politics, and as far as I'm concerned, any sort of identity politics is anathema to universities. And because identity politics are inherent, they are baked into decolonization ideology. It's you're never gonna win if you drink that Kool-Aid. You really, it's just very difficult to sort of have a productive, constructive, cordial conversation about it. because you just get told,
100%.
well,
Yeah.
you don't know. I mean,
Mm.
there are one of the ironies is that a lot of this activism, most of it, actually comes from universities in the beginning, and
Mm.
it's very ironic that if you drill into decolonization, what you find is that the the basic ideology of it came from universities in America and in Europe. It's people,
I
like
think it
Foucault.
started in. I think
Go
it
on.
started in. Well, the kind of roots of it are probably French, but I think that specifically the settler colonialism stuff really took off in Australia
You think so?
initially. Yeah, I think that is. So I believe we've got an article that's coming out on this. I don't remember the details now, but I think that it first became very popular in Australia, or at least one specific strand of it, and that then went to the American universities, and then from there it spread across the world. But I think some of the pioneers were Australian
Really?
academics,
Okay.
actually.
Well, if that's the case, I didn't know. I
Sorry.
mean, well, post-colonial scholarship, people like Edward Said, who was
mm,
Palestinian, and Gayatri
mm,
Spivak, who was Indian,
mm.
but both of them developed their ideas when they were at universities in the United States.
Yeah, yeah, of course.
And as I
Yeah,
said, Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, the author of Decolonizing Methodologies, she's an academic. So
mm,
these ideas, a lot of this comes out of, Doug Stokes' book, which I can recommend. He talks about this 3-layered history of how these ideas developed. Started with people like Foucault, Derrida, the French postmodernists, then went through post-colonial scholars like Said and Gayatri Spivak, and then you got into critical race theory, people like Derek Bell,
mm.
what's the name, the American academic, Judith Butler, and so on. And then you got up into contemporary manifestations of this, like Robin DiAngelo and Ibram X. Kendi and that sort of thing. I mean, they're not decolonization ideology people, but that's critical social justice ideology.
Mm,
But
mm.
nonetheless, all of those sort of flavors are part of decolonization ideology. And it
Yeah,
means that, as you're saying, there's this sort of idea of people, it's fine to punch up. In other words, if you're in a press group, you're free to criticize anybody who you consider has power, but you're not allowed to punch down, which means that I'm not allowed to say anything about anybody who's, I'm not allowed to express views, even if I think they're antithetical to what I think I'm paid to do on a daily basis.
yeah.
So in
I
terms
wanted
of,
to. Yeah.
yeah, go on.
Could I just clarify something that I said
Sure.
before, which is I'm actually all in favor of more people identifying as Aboriginal, because I think it would be great to preserve the culture and history. And my issue is always when people use that to try to just bulldoze through their point of view and pretend that they need to be, their viewpoint needs to be shown an intrinsic respect. They need to be thought of as right and other people as wrong on the basis of their membership in some identity group. That is the
Usually,
part of it that I object to.
yeah,
Not,
sure.
I don't. I'm happy with people deciding they're Aboriginal. That's great, but then I don't want them saying on the basis of being Aboriginal, I think this is right, I'm right, and you're wrong, and you can't criticize me because of who I am. And that's equally true with whatever ancestry they do or don't
Yeah,
have. It doesn't matter.
yeah. Um, the I mean, I agree. I've got no problem at all with people identifying as Maori. That's absolutely fine. The issue is when we get told things like, you're not allowed to have a view on the relationship between Mātauranga Māori and science because you're not Maori.
Mm. Yeah.
What was interesting is that plenty of people who weren't scientists felt
Mm.
perfectly happy to express their views on this.
Yeah.
That part of it didn't matter. But the identity part that was kind of central. And that's what I'm getting at when I say I have a big problem with identity politics. It's not people identifying with their culture. I've got no problem with that at all. It's when you use it to kind of weaponize or claim authority over something at the expense of somebody else's ideas. That I don't think that way of thinking is compatible with universities.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything that you wanted to talk about that I haven't given you a chance to talk about? Or anything you hoped I would ask that I haven't asked you?
I think, well, one brief thing, and that is that this is maybe seen as a subsidiary point, but this is a point about academic freedom. So I think most people understand what academic freedom is. It's supposed to be related to your area of your disciplinary knowledge. So in other words, we're free to speak. I guess it's probably a proviso that we don't sort of claim to be speaking on behalf of our institution. But as I said, I think that should be considered the default position. And if you had institutional neutrality, you would.
Yeah.
But what's happening at the moment with a lot of this material that is being taught in university classes that isn't actually part of the discipline is that students are going to feel under great pressure not to ask questions about that. And there are a number of reasons for that. One, these compulsory courses, you have to pass in them to get your degree. And they're not going to want to get offside with the people who are teaching them and marking their assignments and grading their exams, etc. And so I think there is going to be a lot of self-censorship among students. I mean, I know I've spoken to students who've said, I just want to get my degree. There's nothing in it for me to sort of raise issues about this. And so there's only grief in it for me if I if I sort of say, look, I'm paying money for this. Why am I having to take it? And
can I just quickly read a course description, because
Sure.
I think people might not be familiar. So this is from the University of Auckland, and it's just one example, and it is from 2025. I'm not going to pronounce any of these words correctly. So the course prescription, I wonder why it's a prescription rather than a description. It's about contemporary science in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Course prescription says, Ko waipapa taumata rau tatu. Welcome to your study in Te Ware Putayo. I really apologize to everybody for butchering all of the pronunciations of Maori. The Faculty of Science. This core course, considers how knowledge of place enhances your learning, the significance of Te Tiri o Waitangi. Is that the Treaty of Waitangi?
That's the Treaty of Waitangi. I should say, Waipapa Taumata Rau is the name gifted to the University of Auckland by the Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei, the local hapu of Ngāti Whātua, the iwi in this region. And one of the things that I should have said earlier about Mātauranga Māori is that the knowledge is very place-based. So what that means is that, and this makes sense if you think about it in terms of living in a particular environment. If you're living, well, I'll give you an Australian example, seeing you're from Australia. The environment in Townsville, where I did my PhD at James Cook University, that's part of the dry tropics, is quite different to the environment in Hobart in Tasmania, right? And so the flora and fauna and the climate and seasonality, all of those things are very different. And so when you think about how experience builds up into an understanding of local environments, you can see how local knowledge is important. But that is then, I'll let you finish, and then maybe I can come back and comment a bit further.
So the this core course, seems to be a compulsory course, considers how knowledge of place enhances your learning, the significance of Te Tiri o Waitangi, and how knowledge systems frame understanding. It provides foundational, essential skills to support you in your first year and future studies. Sustainability is used as a lens to explore what it means to practice contemporary science in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And it says, find out why place matters to science through global and local place-based examples. You will learn essential skills to support your future learning and employability, which I find a little bit weird. And so I think that it sounds kind of nice. It's like a geography course, basically talking about some specific examples of local ecologies, I guess. But this idea that knowledge systems frame understanding, and that should be something that you're talking about in a science class, and that science is kind of, that place is essential to science. And I think it's kind of the opposite, that you use universal understanding, a universal way of understanding things, to look at the local examples and understand them correctly. So, the environment's completely different in Townsville and in Hobart, but nevertheless, science is the same in Townsville and in Hobart. Science is the same in the tropics and in Antarctica, So the lens through which you're looking at things should be a lens of trying to understand them, rather than a lens of something that sounds vaguely political, like sustainability.
Yes. So, of course, what's coming into tension here is the fundamental importance of place in Mātauranga Māori versus in science. Place is generally not important. If we think about something like Krebs cycle in biochemistry, energy metabolism, it doesn't matter where you are. That's the same. Quantum mechanics, Shakespeare, these sorts of things don't matter. But that's actually a good example of a way in which something that makes sense in the context of Mātauranga Māori doesn't make sense if you're going to take it out of context and put it somewhere else. In this case, in terms of science. So absolutely. I'll just read you. So we talked about, you read the course description, and I raised the issue of how are students going to be treated in this course. Well, I don't mean to disparage any of the people who are teaching these courses, but what I'm going to read you is a document that is available on not my university, but Massey University website. So this is from somebody who set up a compulsory course. This is not a science course, but a course along sort of similar lines with a similar rationale at Massey University, another university in New Zealand. And so this is a quote. Some students complained about left bias, a lack of balance, and the way in which all the woes of the world are blamed on British colonialism. While overt racist statements are thankfully rare, racism was inherent in some students' comments and coursework and needed careful management, particularly in a classroom or online class forum. Moments like these are challenging and can be disruptive, but can also provide opportunities for reflection and learning, both for the individual students involved and for those watching on. End quote. 2 comments on that. She's basically saying that the idea that blaming all the woes of the world on British colonialism is somehow racist, and claiming a lack of balance is somehow racist, and I don't believe that at all. But the other thing is, what she then seems to be advocating is that the students who do raise this will be forced to participate in something like a struggle session, out of the Cultural Revolution, where they're forced to have the world explained to them and told what they should believe. And this is kind of what concerns me about this very ideologically based teaching. And a lot of this, and this is why I'm concerned about backlash against this. We talked about the United States previously and what's happening there right now. I don't want there to be a backlash against Māori. I don't want there to be a backlash against Mātauranga Māori, because we should value those and we should preserve them. But you can't impose things on people out of context and then not expect some people to object to that. And I really wonder at the wisdom of what's going on.
It's also,
with some of this.
I mean, anybody who's taught at university knows that it can be quite difficult to get students to talk openly and freely about things. It can be quite hard to get students to discuss things. I find that the most challenging element of teaching, but it's trivially easy to get students to shut up. If you even hint that if they say X and Y, that could affect their grades or whatever, you can effectively silence people really, really quickly without even being terribly heavy-handed about it. You can just stack the incentive such that you discourage and punish honesty, and you only need to scapegoat and punish a few people for everybody else to start self-censoring.
Sure. I mean, there are ways that we were encouraged to make students feel more comfortable, particularly Māori and Pacifica students. One way that I use is to give what's called a pepeha, which is like a personal introduction where you talk about, in Māori, your monga, your awa, and your iwi, which means your mountain, your river, and your tribe. So that's the idea of where are you from, geographically, and who are your people. And I just do this quite simply. Mary Roberts, this friend of mine who taught at Awanga, helped me do this. And I'm very comfortable doing this because even if it's only a couple of students in the class, if it makes them feel more comfortable, makes me feel more approachable, all of that, there's no cost to me in doing that, and I encourage other people to do that. But that's not the same thing as telling students what to think. That's simply trying to make them feel comfortable about interacting with me, so that I become more familiar to them, and I'm sort of giving them some insight into who I am and that sort of thing. So there are positive ways I think we can use these these cultural ideas. Anyhow.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. You've been a fantastic guest.
No, thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.